Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar. Today we're going to discuss and present several of the essays from our collection that was just released yesterday from our Carnegie's Digital Democracy Network. I'm going to offer a few words of introduction about the essay collection and about the members of the network who are here today to talk and discuss some of the bigger themes as well as the individual pieces that they wrote. And I look forward to having a really robust and interesting conversation as well as comments and questions from the audience. A few words about Carnegie's Digital Democracy Network. The network is comprised of a group of leading thinkers and activists who are engaged in work on technology, politics, both research as well as advocacy. Members represent a diverse set of countries and regions from Brazil and Turkey to Nigeria, Uganda, Thailand, and many more. The network is dedicated to generating original analysis and enabling cross-regional knowledge sharing to fill critical research and policy gaps. I urge you to check out the Digital Democracy Network homepage. That'll give you an opportunity to look at other research that has been generated this year and in prior years, as well as commentary from different members. Now, about the collection of essays from this particular volume. These essays stem from a workshop that we convened last year in Istanbul, in Turkey. They illustrate a critical juncture that the world faces when it comes to how the rules regarding tech are changing, where and how country incentives are shifting, what is happening in terms of the globe's biggest norm setter, the United States, and how it's pivoting, and the ways in which citizens, governments, and leaders are asking tough questions about who should exert control and shape the digital environment. A result is that we're seeing growing fragmentation, individual countries erecting digital walls, or at least exerting their own sovereign decisions when it comes to determining how and what digital services and products are allowed to operate. And that there, I think, a growing recognition that tech innovation equals power, and that the more countries can exert control, the more they have the ability to make decisions individually about the shape of their own environment. The collection itself is divided into four general themes. The first set of essays focuses on how local actors are navigating this new tech landscape. Lillian Nalwoga, one of our members here, in her essay explores the challenges and upsides of Starlink's satellite internet deployment in Africa. Jonathan Corpus-Ong and Dean Jackson have an essay analyzing the landscape of counter-disinformation funding in local contexts, and they argue about that the mismatch between funder priorities and activist strategies creates some difficult questions. Janjira Sombatpoonsiri, who is also here today to talk about her essay, examines the role of local actors in foreign influence operations in Southeast Asia. A second set of essays in the collection explores the evolving applications of digital repression. Irene Potranto argues that understanding government restrictions on online content requires looking beyond legal regulations to examine the technical aspects of internet governance control. And she does a case study of Indonesia in that respect. Yubenga Sesan's article tracks the harms of internet shutdowns taking place around the globe. And then I have a piece along with Mackenzie Carrier that analyzes the AI-first strategy of the U.S. government's Department of Government Efficiency, cautioning how the deployment of automated techniques can destroy institutions, wipe out accountability, and enable corruption to flourish, as a warning sign for other countries. A third set of essays focuses on national strategies and digital sovereignty debates. Arindrajit Basu cautions against the Trump administration's shift away from the digital solidarity agenda and offers ideas about how to bring different aspects of the current administration together with former ideas. Eugenio Gagliardone examines how Kenyan gig workers and South Africa's data sovereignty debates shed light on pathways for resistance, negotiation, and adaptation in the pursuit of AI sovereignty. And then a fourth and final set of essays explores pressing tech policy and regulatory questions. Luca Belli has an article examining the intersection of cybersecurity and AI and uses Brazil as a case study for exploring the dilemma inherent in these developments. And then Akin Unver, who is also here as our third speaker and guest today, describes the development of the Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Framework, FIMI, which has become the dominant method in Canada, the EU, and the United States to analyze trends in the information space. So the run of show is that we will engage in conversation between myself and the three authors here for 45 minutes or so, and then we will reserve 15 minutes for your questions, which you can submit in YouTube using the chat function. So start thinking now, and you are welcome to start putting in questions in the queue that we will then do our best to take up as we approach the end of the hour here. So what I'd like to do, let me quickly offer introductions for each of our DDN members and panelists, and then we'll launch into the conversation. So I'll start with Janjira Sombatpoonsiri. She is a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies and an assistant professor at Thailand's Chulalongkorn University. Her current research focuses on autocratic weaponization of disinformation laws, digital propaganda and conflict narratives in Southeast Asia, and digital repression of protest movements. Her academic articles appear in a variety of journals, including the International Journal of Communication, the Journal of Contemporary Asia, Voluntas, the Journal of Peace Research, and she's also a regional manager for the Digital Society Project. Next, we have Lillian Nalwoga, who is a program manager at the Collaboration on International ICT Policy in East and Southern Africa, better known as CPESA. Lillian is a tech researcher and advocate interested in promoting and advancing the appropriate use of ICT for empowerment and development. She has over 10 years experience in internet policy research and implementing ICT4D projects in Africa, with the active involvement, as well as with active involvement in internet governance debates at the local, regional, and global levels, through her role as a coordinator of the Uganda and East Africa Internet Governance Forums. Lillian has served on the UN Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group of the Global Internet Governance Forum. She currently serves on the Global Network Initiative Board and has served in the Danish Institute for Human Rights Advisory Board for Digital Transition, the Human Rights Project in Sub-Saharan Africa. Third, we have Akin Unver, Associate Professor of International Relations at Özyeğin University in Istanbul. Previously, Akin was a research fellow at the Oxford University Center of Technology and Global Affairs, the Oxford Internet Institute, the Alan Turing Institute in London, and taught graduate courses on political conflict at Princeton, Michigan, and Oxford. His research interests sit at the intersection of emerging technologies, diplomacy, and international security, with a particular focus on how social media affects subnational conflict and civil war dynamics. Dr. Unver also previously served as a scientific advisor to the European External Action Service, the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs Innovation Cell, and Facebook's Content Policy Team. He serves as an associate editor of the Global Studies Quarterly and a member of the International Studies Association's Governing Council, and has a PhD in government from the University of Essex. So welcome all, three of you. Again, we're really happy to have you here. And why don't we dive right in? So I'll first turn and ask a question for Lillian, whose piece, as I mentioned, explores both the opportunities and the pitfalls when it comes to Starlink's growing expansion in sub-Saharan Africa. So your piece outlines these different issues, and it acknowledges that Starlink is a valuable and perhaps preferable tool compared to other options. So why do you, in your sort of understanding, why are nations investing in this platform despite the risks? And what upsides do you see that Starlink presents compared to rival options from countries like, for example, China?
Thank you, Steve, for having me. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. And again, yeah, you rightly say in my piece, I highlight the benefits of satellite technology like Starlink, its potential to significantly close Africa's digital divide, but also why it has become the most preferred kind of, satellite technology is known that it is unique to other options, like say from China. The one thing that probably to give a bit of context is Africa is still on the lower end when it comes to internet access. We just have about 38% of the total population in Africa having access to internet, compared to 87% in Europe and maybe 92% in America. And for Starlink comes in to connect mainly that unconnected, and this has been the focus for many African states, who are looking at closing that digital divide. If we are looking at the Africa Union digital transformation strategy, that is the biggest issue that they are looking at. But also, why Starlink is currently being used or being offered as the most viable option is that it carries the niche that is going to, the capability of going to, underserved regions where national operators, that traditional telecom operators, are unable to reach. And that is where we are looking at in terms of providing that. So whether it is in Accra or Kinshasa or Lagos, there's still the issue of bridging that divide. We are seeing disparities that even in rural, in urban areas where we have connectivity, we still have a divide when it comes to access. For instance, Starlink focuses mainly, is looking at a small segment. It is looking at profit, but also they are looking at high level, segments, remote workers, oil and gas operations. And currently there's quite a lot of oil and gas operations happening in Africa, whether it's in Lagos, whether it is, for instance, in Uganda, where I come from, there's quite a huge investment in that area. So early tech adopters, government clients, and these are probably the biggest clients. So whereas options like, say, China, which have been there for some time, they are having a segment, they are looking at a wider reach. Starlink comes in with that opportunity that they are looking at small, high-value segments. Remote workers who need fast, reliable internet, there's no disruption, and that is what they are looking for. So as we have seen in the article when we're doing the analysis, what I found was that this is where the niche is. People just want fast internet. I don't care if I'm in an urban area. Starlink is able to give me that high fast internet. But however, I wouldn't say that it is probably the most reliable option that we can go for, because it has had a bit of, there are quite a bit of concerns, whether it's on data sovereignty, there are key issues of data storage. We've seen countries, for instance, like, say, in Senegal, which cancelled or which refused to issue a license to Starlink, citing, it was not falling under, those regulations. Some of these regulations, and I think he talked about data sovereignty. The option they went to was China, which I also don't think that the Chinese data governance model is one that is most reliable. So there are these kind of concerns. But at the moment, I would say that Starlink is coming out as the highest bidder for the satellite connectivity in Africa, because it is targeting a niche that already has money, but they are looking for that high-speed internet that can be used to be able to meet their everyday demands. Thank you, Steve.
That's great. Thank you, Lillian. And I want to delve a little further into some of the questions regarding, what you mentioned as in terms of reliability. But we'll get to that. I'll let you. I think it's a really interesting kind of an open framing, when you talk about the access issues and the fact that you have many areas that would benefit from having greater connectivity, and where, there has been real problems and challenges trying to get to, whether it's the last mile or just, certain sub-regions that aren't necessarily benefiting from fiber optic cable connections and so forth. So Starlink can fill that gap, at least in theory. Let me turn to Janjira. So one of the key points in your essay, Janjira, is that foreign influence operations, and it was a really interesting piece that talks about different ways in which they are often shaped and determined by local actors. And then you go on to detail 3 specific reasons for why local influence actors exploit information drawn from geopolitical narratives. Can you provide detail about these dynamics and the kind of theory of the case that you present in your essay?
Hi, Steve. Hi, everyone. So yeah, thanks for having me here as well. So first off, I just want to sort of give a little bit of the background, like why I start, diving into this subject. I mean, I focus on this issue because much of the current conversation about foreign influence operations, or FIOs, some of which Akin will touch upon as well, tends to assume that foreign powers like China or Russia are pushing their agendas onto passive local populations. So, many studies look at how these countries try to spread distrust in democracy and the leadership of the US, so on and so forth. And so I think that while there's definitely some truth to this, that view can be a bit too one-sided, especially in Southeast Asia, right? Where online influence campaigns have become a booming business over the past decade. And so in the essay, I kind of argue that we need to take local actors more seriously, how people on the ground aren't just passive targets, but rather actively shape and spread these influence campaigns. And so I sort of delve into three main reasons to explain why local actors in Southeast Asia engage in influence operations using geopolitical narratives. And reason number one is financial incentives. Of course, in places like the Philippines, especially under former President Duterte, but also this practice continues under the current administration. The whole influence industry grew with ties with business elites. And so some of these elites wanting closer economic ties with China might help fund pro-China content online because it benefited their business interest. So that's reason number one. And reason number two is about political gain. Local politicians and elites often use global geopolitical narratives for their own advantage during elections, right? So the essay kind of dives into ways in which candidates from Thailand to Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, sometimes might be accused of being backed by foreign powers. And these kind of campaigns that frame candidates as being Western puppets, as being backed by foreign powers, can seriously damage their reputation, right? And in Thailand, particularly state-backed campaigns, influence campaigns, have used anti-Western messaging to justify legal action against activists by painting them as, Western lackeys, traitors, someone who sell their country out to foreign power. And so this is a kind of narratives that sort of combine nationalism in a way, and I can come back to that point later, with broader geopolitical rhetoric. Now, the third and last reason concerns ideological appeal in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, where public concern over issues such as Palestine is quite strong. People are more likely to support narratives that criticize the West. This makes it easier for pro-Russian messages, for example, that accuse the West of using human rights and democracy as a political tool to meddle in domestic agenda to gain traction. So this component, this reason is very intertwined with the political gain part. And again, I can come back to that later. And so this narrative sort of pushes criticism against of the West. And they sometimes sort of encourage local support for events like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which some of these populations see as standing up to US dominance.
Great. Thank you so much, Janjira. I think a really interesting typology in which to consider how these influence operations are persisting. A reminder, we are discussing a collection of essays entitled "The Digital Democracy in a Divided Global Landscape," which you can find on Carnegie's website. I encourage you all, once again, to send in your questions in the chat function, and we'll try to get to them as we get later into this session. Let me now turn to Akin Unver for his piece, which discusses the foreign information manipulation and interference framework, or FIMI framework, that has been adopted by the EU, US, and Canada. So, Akin, if you can tell us what makes FIMI significant, and in particular, given the nature of what it's addressing, to what extent, what happens to FIMI, at least from a U.S. perspective, during the Trump administration? Can it be sustained without the full support or engagement of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see you all again. So the FIMI framework was initiated, within the halls of the European External Action Service in the EU, which is an agency of the European Commission. And the idea was that for years we have been doing research on disinformation, misinformation, but the idea was that although most disinformation projects were ultimately successful, false information by itself isn't enough to capture the full spectrum of actions nations take in international information domain to manipulate each other and interfere in critical processes such as elections, key arms deals processes, or key economic negotiations or diplomatic negotiations. So there is a thing called astroturfing, for example, falsely making the image that there is a public campaign on something. There is hashtag hijacking, which is Group A initiates a hashtag campaign, Group B uses the same hashtag to drag the debate into an entirely different direction, for example. The FIMI framework recognizes that you can do quite a lot of damage into information space without necessarily just relying on disinformation. So the new concept, foreign information manipulation and interference, looks at a broader menu of items in digital information space, including disinformation, but not limited to disinformation. And the framework itself is becoming highly technical and highly scientific, with an integrated lexicon and language of separating these actions. And the forefront of this effort is the Disarm Foundation, which created the framework that many of us use, the Disarm framework, which is a very precise and highly technical description of the types of actions information manipulators use in information space, and the type of actions defenders can take. Now, the idea of the FIMI framework is to basically create an international information alliance, if you will, initially a transatlantic alliance between the EU and the United States, and then it became popular in Canada, and it became popular in Taiwan, Southeastern Europe, South Korea, Japan, and then Singapore, and then Vietnam. It is increasingly becoming this global alliance in the information space by like-minded allies, which use the same lexicon to refer to information attack and defense options, pooling their resources to create a joint repository of events of foreign information manipulation and interference, so that they can address those problems in a joint fashion. Of course, in the new US administration, many of our colleagues in the United States who had amazing projects that were linking up beautifully with the research in the EU. Many of them, I don't want to name them because I don't know what might happen to their projects if I do. But suddenly those projects lost their funding, which is an incredibly big problem, not just for the United States, but for those of us in the EU as well, because US institutions still lead in many of the technical measurement aspects, cataloging aspects, database management, and database coordination aspects of these things. So in a way, this huge brain power of these like massive American educational institutions and research institutions is not gone, but it's significantly weakened. Now, this is of course a short-term problem, but it also opens up the way for other allies to maximize their resources, generate funding, and increase the synergies, diplomatic synergies that they have in order to build alternatives, at least in the interim. And there are many Southeast Asian and European Union joint projects ongoing right now for common detection of FIMI incidents, especially from Russia and China, common pooling in of methods, especially, I'm going to use computer science terms, but entity recognition, survival analysis, time series analysis of FIMI incidents that leading institutions in Europe and Southeast Asia are right now joining their forces in order to compensate for this loss of engagement and funding from American universities. In the short term, it's definitely a problem, but it also gives some opportunity for other parts of the world in order to boost their cooperation and collaboration, and think of a framework which right now doesn't necessarily include the United States, but in the future, a framework that the United States can hopefully rejoin and serve as a multiplier in most of those efforts. So that's pretty much what I have.
It's great. Thank you, Akin. I think, it's interesting. You kind of put a finer point on a bigger underlying topic that we'll kind of get into a little more, which is that in ways that are both big and small, in the last few months, the United States has withdrawn either from informal non-governmental consortiums because of politicization of a particular issue or funding lapses. And one of the consequences of that is certainly a disruption to kind of the knowledge generation effort, to the ability to take and can maintain momentum for initiatives that address critical issues. On the flip side, I think it is, if there's a silver lining to any of this at all, is that it does open up space potentially for other actors to step in, for other research institutions to be able to set the parameters, to offer up their ideas, perhaps to attract some of the researchers who otherwise feel that they have unreliable, if disrupted, funding from the American institutional side, and to go to places where they can actually continue the work and perhaps do so in a less distracted manner. So where there is change and disruption, there also is opportunity, albeit one that perhaps is shifting a bit away from the shores of the United States. I will also just sort of say and briefly comment too that it's not just the funding going to American universities, at least on this issue, that's being disrupted. It is also the government institutions themselves, the Global Engagement Center, other entities like that have been fully dismantled and taken apart in this administration. And so when you lack a government center in which to coordinate, in which to channel these resources, not to mention the resources themselves being stymied, there's not very much left when it comes to having energy momentum in which to continue pursuing these initiatives. So it's a difficult spot the United States is in when it comes to these questions. I want to go back to Lillian and, ask a little more about the kind of, when it comes to Starlink, the sort of elephant in the room, which is that the leadership of Starlink by Elon Musk. Certainly, he is a controversial and polarizing figure, in the United States and globally. He is taking very explicit steps to align himself politically with a particular movement, and the consequences of that have been felt all over the place, both domestically in the United States context, but certainly internationally as well. Hand in hand with the questions about what effect Elon Musk's leadership on Starlink potentially has when it comes to the interest of countries in sub-Saharan Africa to adopt these systems are reports, and including a report more recently from ProPublica that details how U.S. officials have been pushing countries in Africa to provide regulatory approvals for Starlink, potentially in exchange for tariff reliefs. So I'm curious, what do you make of these trends? What are perceptions when it comes to what seems to be, on the one hand, questions about the reliability of Starlink's leadership, and on the other hand, a concerted and potentially pretty explicit push by the U.S. government to get countries to adopt Starlink, aside from just the kind of technological or economic reasons they might do so anyway.
Thanks, Steve. Very interesting kind of question, given we started with saying that, this is some sort of, the much needed kind of connectivity that we as a continent would love. But again, there are these other issues that, cannot be overlooked. And much as, Starlink is on the rise in terms of usage in many countries, it has not been without controversies. And these are usually mainly around regulations, Starlink being able to comply with current regulations, legislation around digital, telecom infrastructure. And it's not a one-off, say, in one country, but across all the countries that Starlink has been able to, operate, there has not been a controversy. And the story that you just shared from ProPublica is not something new. At least we've had from instances where in countries, for instance, say in Zimbabwe, for instance, where we had issues, Starlink being banned by government because it was being used illegally, I think because of the roaming. Months after Starlink officials meet with the Zimbabwe president, Starlink is given a license, to operate even as a telecom, a telecom operator, which is kind of suspicious. So again, it is very hard to separate the owner of Starlink, who is Elon Musk, and like you said, there's a bit of political controversy around him. It's very hard to separate his actions as a person and also that of a company. I mean, with the great much influence that we've seen that he has had on the US government, we can only say that the same influence is still having within the company. So instances like this kind of show that governments which are questionable, especially around their kind of, democracy practice, countries like, say, Zimbabwe, countries like Kenya recently that are falling off the democracy pathway in a very fast pace, are kind of suspicious. So I like mentioning the case of Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe has had quite a number of controversies in terms of human rights or security violations, just like many, countries. But when it came to Starlink, it was a bit of very much suspicious, as we found out that, the telecoms regulator, which is the Postal Telecom Regulator, Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe, awarded the contract to a businessman who has close ties with the president to run, to operate the Starlink in the country. Again, where we have seen these issues before, people have raised concerns about Starlink being used for surveillance purposes, considering that it is not, it is a satellite company headquartered in, in the US. They may be able to comply. They don't have local presence. And it's very hard, honestly, to be able to monitor, what is happening in a satellite. And besides the laws that we have, the current regulatory frameworks in Africa do not really cater so much for satellite services or like what Starlink is offering. But more interesting, we've seen, now that I mentioned Zimbabwe, there's a similar pattern when it came to Kenya. Kenya initially did not grant, had also issues with regulations and licensing with the way Starlink or satellite operates, and it had a requirement of 30% local ownership to be able to own, to have an IT company within the country. But again, there was a pattern that the president had a meeting with some Starlink officials, and months later, that requirement was removed, and again, Starlink was allowed to operate. So there are these kind of controversies that we cannot overlook, and where you cannot separate the ownership of the person, of the company, from the individual, then that creates a bit of concern. And perhaps the most interesting case is the case of South Africa, where we know that Musk is, originally in quotes from South Africa, and there's been this controversy that has escalated in international diplomacy, where up to now, Starlink is still struggling to get a license in South Africa because it has failed to meet the licensing requirements. Or and part of this is about ownership, where if you're to operate a foreign telecom company or any company, not just limited to Starlink, the company needs to grant at least 30% of local ownership from historically disadvantaged groups. South Africa is much of a divided country, historically, even up to date. And this, when they say disadvantaged groups, they are not just saying black or white or, in that category. It is women, youth, people living with disabilities, extra. But again, there's been that kind of pushback from Starlink, and we've seen accusations which are public, with claims that Starlink has been is not granted this license because Musk is black and all that, and this has escalated into some kind of diplomacy issue, where we've seen the South African government going into conversations. We've seen, a lot has been happening in this month, where we saw the parading of you're killing white people. This is happening, and just because of the false claims that are being put around by the person who is supposed probably to be able to defend the country, or I don't know if defend is the word, but someone who is able to a citizen of a country who, because of his own controversial, issues, or his kind of personality, is not able to separate himself from politics and from the company. So there are these issues that cannot be underlooked, and they raise quite of concerns when it comes to, say, just blanketly giving Starlink a license. But also, I think we've also seen issues where the company, when they use the back doors and they don't follow the proper regulatory requirements, they may be, it may backfire in the future, where, if we are to work backwards, because technology moves at a faster rate than policies. So right now, the article that ProPublica published, I think, highlighting how Starlink is navigating the regulatory hurdles in the Gambia, and how the Gambian government is being coerced to issue a license in exchange to reducing the tariffs, is very, very worrying. And where we are saying that Starlink could help in bridging the digital divide, we've also seen them hiking prices, without notice. And at the same time, we are saying that, oh yeah, it could be the savior for the whole digital divide in Africa. Again, it's a give and take. And if you can't do this for me, then I cannot do that for you. So there's that bit of controversy where we are saying that we need to strike a balance. Governments need to strike a balance. What are they prioritizing? Is it a reduction in tariffs, or is it utilizing technology for the technical, for the greater good, not just a one-off? Because I mean, this is tariffs are temporary. Today they could go up, the next day they go down, but we rely so much on technology, especially the internet. So if you're granting access to a company which already has controversy around, the person owning it, there are controversies on privacy. There's controversies. They could just wake up and hike prices like what they did in Nigeria. I mean, for a country like, say, Gambia, which is really very much on the very low income income countries when it comes to Africa, and there was a bit of more profiting. Telecom companies were kind of, profiting more from that. And then you put in the competition from Starlink, then halfway the prices go up. It would not have served the purpose that, it wants to do in terms of, say, bridging that so-called digital divide. So my thoughts could go around there, but yeah, thanks, Steve.
No, thank you, Lillian. That's really interesting. And I really thought it helps to kind of make this issue real when you provide sort of like these on the ground empirical examples, whether in Zimbabwe, Kenya, or the Gambia, as you were just talking. And I really think you point to kind of two levels of issues. I think on the one hand, we are talking about digital infrastructure that's crucial to a country, both in terms of its economy, in terms of politics, in terms of its own security. And so on that level alone, I think there have been growing questions about the power of foreign platforms and to what extent do countries have the ability to make decisions about how that will be used, both for good or potentially not. But either way, there's a sovereignty issue at play here, even if Starlink was run in an open, transparent, non-controversial manner. But with Starlink and under Elon Musk's leadership, you have a second level where you have a volatility and a politicization associated with the service that adds even more, I think, difficult questions to the equation when it comes to trustworthiness, reliability, and so on. And as I've detailed in my own essay with McKinsey, the results of his leadership and his involvement in politics in the U.S. context has been absolutely devastating for the workforce and for different programs. And so I don't think we can look past that. I think they all comes part of an entangled package. Just a reminder, we are discussing essays in the volume entitled Digital Democracy in a Divided Global Landscape. I encourage you to send in your questions in YouTube's chat function. We're happy to start taking those up in a few minutes as we continue working our way through our webinar. In the meantime, let me turn now back over to Janjira and ask you a follow-up question, which is that you detailed 3 different types of tactics when it comes to how foreign influence informations are shaped by local actors. You talked about kind of financial incentives, more political packaging, and then ideological messaging that uses and trades off that local influence actors exploit when it comes from pushing out their own information narratives. Can you tell me a little more, which do you think has proven to be the most potent? And can you talk to me about how you think foreign information operations can change form as a result of this type of local co-optation or exploitation?
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting because, as I mentioned before, that the increasing interplay between political use and ideological appeal aspect of local actors' exploitation of FIOs, foreign influence operations, has become very prevalent. And I think the mix is effective because it's almost like there's supply and demand side of this, right? So on the one hand, you have local politicians who are very savvy, discursively speaking, and they might grab or hold on to these international narratives. For example, anti-immigration narrative that's being circulated around in the West at the moment, and they use that and they incorporate that kind of message into their election campaigns. And now, in certain areas where there might be political crisis or public health crisis like during COVID, then the population felt that this kind of narrative of strongman, of someone who will take care of our security, who will get rid of threats like immigrants. So there's local appeal like that when in times of uncertainty and there's a lot of public anxiety. And so once there is local politicians' use of this kind of narrative in the context where there is popular demand, it tends to be very, very effective, right? And I think one example I can provide here is in the case of Indonesia, for example. This kind of online discourse of anti-immigrants have been around. I think it was during before the election last year, it was December 2023. Local actors in Aceh, where the Rohingya refugees stationed, and they were hosted. They are hosted in Aceh, part of Indonesia. Now, local politicians start to mobilize, votes by using local resentment against the Rohingya refugees. And this is a bit strange because you would assume that because Indonesians are predominantly Muslims, and so they should show solidarity with Muslim fellows. But the whole twist is that these Rohingya refugees are replacing or they are being they occupy the land of the natives, right? So they're not real Muslims; they are invaders, and the whole message sounds almost like the Great Replacement theory that has been very popularized by right-wing, influencers in the West. So there's this kind of like mix and match, choose and take part of the global rhetorics and use in the local context. So I think to answer your question, how does the localization of FIOs change the operations and the tactics itself? I think increasingly we start seeing this hybridization, which makes the message that's being imported from outside the country more in tune with local narratives, belief system, and ideologies, and that makes it more appealing, more persuasive for local population. And when that happens, one of the trends that I observe is how this combination of foreign and local accounts become more humanized. Against the trend of automation of these information accounts, right? You start seeing less and less automated accounts that become increasingly effective because they understand local context, they understand how to adapt something, an outside discourse to something more familiar to local population. So I think with that, these kind of campaigns become very, very localized and very difficult for you to detect whether or not this is from outside or from within.
Thank you, Janjira. And let me ask a question for this comes from one of the viewers that for you and perhaps Akin as well to address, which is that you talk about this sort of localized aspect to how these disinformation narratives are exploited and how you can finely tune them to make them appealable to local populations. But there also seems to be, I think, a sort of degree of unity when it comes to the types of disinformation, the general tropes that you see propagated around the world. So, for example, the anti-West attacks in Southeast Asia, such as the anti-Soros conspiracy theory, is a variation, if not similar, to what you see used in the U.S. context and in Europe. And so, how do you see that balance between, on the one hand, common narratives, and on the other hand, what you describe as sort of specific ways in which these common narratives are tweaked or shaped to fit and to have broader appeal to specific populations?
Yeah, I think this is excellent question, because what you see is the form and content, right? So the Soros conspiracy is definitely the form of this kind of influence operations, the shell of this narrative, right? That the inside content can be hollow out and change and adapt to local context. For example, in Thailand, it would be about Soros funding pro-democracy group in order to overthrow the Thai monarchy, and in other predominantly Muslim countries, it's anti-Semitic kind of content, right? So I think that this kind of geopolitical narratives provide a broad shell, and then local actors kind of like make use of them quite smartly, actually.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think it's sort of like a vessel that can be mutated as needed.
Yeah.
Akin, I have a more specific FEMI question, but I also welcome encourage you to weigh on this question as well. Let me ask you my broader FEMI question, then you can choose how and what you want to answer. But one of the things I thought was interesting in your piece is that you identify challenges when it comes to platforms and the lack of data access, and as well as platform differences across companies that make it challenging to facilitate FEMI efforts. To what extent is this something that is overcomable, and how are governments potentially addressing this constraint when it comes to providing or encouraging companies to provide greater platform access to enhance these efforts?
Yeah, and I think that is, to me, the most important question of FEMI at the moment, because the greatest amount of scientific knowledge we developed, not just on FEMI or disinformation, but on like digital polarization and digital extremism, belongs to the period when Facebook was providing quite rich and free research API. API, for those of you who don't know, is application programming interface, which is basically your right of getting access to data from that platform. When Facebook and formerly Twitter were providing the most data access, that is the period when we generated the most knowledge regarding any kind of digital extremism or anomaly. Over the course of the years, Meta in general restricted how much who can get data, especially non-US researchers have significant trouble accessing Meta's data and work on the questions related to disinformation, misinformation, FEMI, extremism, polarization, so on and so forth. And after Elon Musk took over Twitter and it became X, not only data access became hugely problematic, but even if you pay the most amount of money for the API of X today, you still get spotty, patchy data, which is a lower quality data compared to how much we could have received before Elon Musk period for free, essentially. So essentially, I think platforms have quite a significant amount of responsibility, which is, one, they can help foreign researchers, not just American researchers, international researchers, to basically find evidence and collect data on detection and mitigation, because platforms themselves have the highest level of threat intelligence teams and early warning systems for their own platform. And then, of course, data sharing and transparency is quite missing nowadays. And usually, TikTok gets the blame for most of that, like absence of data sharing and transparency issues as well. But X and Meta also has quite a high degree of problems on both accounts themselves. It's not data sharing when you only share data with a very small group of American researchers that are 10,000 times pre-vetted, and then close data access or restrict data access for the rest of the world's researchers. It hurts science in general on these matters. And cross-platform coordination is near absent. There's like really very little collaboration between TikTok, Telegram, X, Meta, YouTube to jointly address extremism or jointly address FIMI. And us as researchers have to get a little bit data from here, a little bit of data from there, and then try to combine that data in our own repositories in order to be able to do any kind of cross-platform work. But it is actually platform's responsibility. We, as researchers, as scientists, shouldn't be struggling to that extent in a way. And I think it is quite important at this point to mention the European Digital Services Act, which requires explicitly from what they call VLOPs, very large online platforms, to separate them from smaller online platforms, is that all very large online platforms are supposed to conduct regular systemic risk assessment, including FIMI risks. Not all platforms are doing it. DSA also requires all platforms to ensure data access to researchers, and most platforms don't. And this is actually a big political fight right now in Europe, in the sense that neither platform actually provides data that they're supposed to under the terms of the Digital Services Act. So, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I was just going to say, no, that's, thank you. I mean, it really, I think, shines a light in a very important way on the constraints that you discussed when it comes to platform cooperation, and how to kind of merge and enhance efforts when it comes to FIMI. Because we only have 3 minutes left, I want to give each of you the final word in terms of any issues that you might want to discuss. We've talked on a lot of things. We've touched on sovereignty questions. We've talked about the kind of localization of foreign information. We've talked about new ways to consider foreign information manipulation. So let me turn to each one of you, starting with Lillian. As you sort of think about where things go from now with the retreat of America and tech policy, with new efforts by countries to potentially assert their independence in this space, and with growing challenges on the digital repression side, what do you see coming up? What is most on your mind?
Thanks, Steve. I think for me, as we try to kind of tread a balance between providing the much needed access, we need, as a continent, there has to be some bit of concern when it comes to digital sovereignty, whether it is about data, whether it's about economic sovereignty. We should not just be allowing big tech companies or big people or big individuals, influential individuals to provide services without really being cautious about the long-term impact. Nonetheless, satellite technology can be used to kind of bridge that much needed connectivity gap that we are still trying to bridge. But at the same time, governments within Africa and other, probably also, it could be the same case with other entities like we've seen, say, in India, or maybe where satellite Starlink, whether it is where it's operating, to be able to have the right regulatory frameworks to be able to prioritize, ownership issues, and rather than politicizing, this kind of, ownership. So for me, it is have the right regulatory frameworks in place, avoid, trade-offs, backdoor access, avoid, quick wins, quick gains that are most likely to impact the wider long-term impact of the much needed technology that we need as a continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We could obviously keep going on and on. Each one of you has so much to offer. I encourage our audience to take a look at their essays and others in the networks. The name of the collection, once more, is Digital Democracy in a Divided Global Landscape. You can find it under Carnegie's Digital Democracy Network on our webpage. But I encourage you to take a look at that. And thank you again for tuning in. Thanks for the three of you for your time. And I look forward to seeing you all in person very soon. Have a great day or evening, wherever you might be, and goodbye.